Hello, everyone, and welcome. Tiffany Mink, Marketing Manager for Interview Valet here, and I am so excited for today's topic because it is our most requested and most downloaded resource that we share, and I'm excited to bring that live to you here today, and that is the 2024 State of Podcast Guesting. It was just released this morning. It's hot from the presses. If you were on our wait list, you should have gotten that email with that downloadable PDF early this morning. If you weren't on the wait list and would like a copy, I will put that over in the chat in just a moment, and you can download your free copy for that as well. Um, and then a couple housekeeping things here as we mentioning the chat. Put over in the chat where you're tuning in from. I am coming to you from the always overcast Pacific Northwest of Whidbey Island. Let us know where you're listening into. We love to see all the different time zones that we can get people from. Um, and then I also want to invite you to use the chat. Please, we want this to be an interactive discussion. So if you have any questions throughout the presentation here, please put those over there. If we don't get to them right away, I'm going to be collecting those, and we'll make sure we address all of them at the end during our Q&A as we wrap up. And I do apologize if you hear some jets. We have the sound of freedom going over me. They are a little active this morning, so I hope that doesn't take away from what we're talking about. And then, so let's get back to why we're here, right? We love sharing this report. We are data nerds here. We love collecting data on everything that we do. And sharing the findings that we see are very important for podcast guests as they're strategizing their podcast interview marketing approach, right? If you are prepared and know what to expect, it makes things a lot easier, right? We know what platforms are podcasts being recorded on, what days of the week are they recording on. And then another really important one is, timelines to expect from making that introduction to scheduling the interview, actually recording the interview, and then it going live. That's important, especially if you're working around a timed event, right? A product launch or a book launch or something like that. You really need to understand what those timelines are so you can plan and work backwards from your goals. So, with that, we're going to dive in because we got a lot to cover. So, I'm going to bring on our presenter, who is also Interview Valet's founder and chief evangelist officer, Tom Schwab.
Tiffany,
Hi, Tom.
I am thrilled to be here. And this is, you said we're data nerds. One of the things that we say around Interview Valet is in God we trust, everybody else bring data. And we've been doing this now for, what is it, 6 years, where we're taking the data that we've learned over the last year, all the data points that we have, and sharing them with the world. Because we learned from this, we share this with our customers real time, but we want to share it with the community, the podcasting community, every year in February, right? In January, we pulled all the data, crunched it, all the rest of that, and really excited for some of the trends we're seeing. If you would have asked me pre-COVID, these numbers would have been unimaginable.
Absolutely. The shift around that, and then also the shift that we're seeing as we're returning to a new normal, right? And I was surprised at some of the findings here that although we're back to normal-ish, right? We're still seeing increasing toward podcasting. It's still it's more relevant now than I think even in 2021, and important, and more people are using it, and so. Really interesting stuff.
Excellent. Well, with
Yeah.
that, I'm going to jump into the data, the numbers, do a little bit of commentary on it. Tiffany will be in the chat, so if you have any questions, put those in there, and we can keep this discussion going live, real time. And also, if I mention any resources, she's going to be frantically pulling them up and putting the links in there.
Will do, Tom. I'll let you have it from here.
All right. So here we go. The State of Podcast Guesting 2024, right? And let me first start out with of what this is and what this isn't, right? So this is all the data that we collected over the last year, right? We collect a lot of data with over 1,500 clients on over 75,000 podcast interviews. We've got data points on each one, and we keep those all in our proprietary database, and we sift through that. So the numbers that I'm showing you here are for podcasts that are mostly, well, all, in that business category. We really work with professional services. We work with with alternative investments, high level coaches, consultants. All of the podcasts we work with also are in the top 20% based on downloads. So I don't know that these numbers hold for comedy podcasts or if they hold out for podcasts that are in the bottom half. I'm just showing you the numbers and the data that we have. And what I always do is call people and say, if you've got different data, please share this with the world so that we can all learn together. So jumping into this, I'd like to thank Alex over at PodPros. He put out some data and he's sharing his data here. One of the things I want to say is that podcast guesting has gotten a whole lot more competitive, right? We've seen this when we first started to do this. I could tell you that there was 4, maybe 5 agencies that did podcast placement, and now it seems like they're popping up all over. But also, the guests are popping up all over. And Alex's number showed that there's about 100,000 podcasts. This is English based that are looking for guests. Well, right now there's 2.6 million guests looking to be on podcast. So where it used to be a double-sided marketplace, lots of podcasts, few guests, now it's about 22, 23 guests per podcast. So not only do you have to be a better guest, you have to stand out a whole lot more. It's not as easy for the podcast host or the podcast guest. So with that in mind, one of the things that we look for is, well, how do people connect, right? And one of the things that I think you'll see in here is that the term podcast has largely changed, right? There's a technical definition of a podcast. And when it first started out, it was, an RSS feed, audio only. But boy, that was 20 years ago. Today podcasts are on YouTube. They're on Sirius XM. You can find some of them that are put out on terrestrial radio. I think of Stacking Benjamins with Joe Saul Sehi, right? That's owned by Podcast One, that also owns a company called Westwood One that syndicates it to all the radio stations out there. So they're repurposing them. Podcast has gotten to be so much bigger of a term there. And the platforms have changed also. And when people say, well, what kind of platform, if I'm going to be on a guest, how do they record? Well, today more than ever, when you say a podcast, it means Zoom. And this has changed drastically since pre-COVID. So in just 4 years, 4 years ago, podcasts meant getting on Skype. And it's changed so much now, right? Now, 70% of the podcasts are done over Zoom, right? Because everybody knows how to do Zoom. We're all comfortable with it, but it's changing and it's changing quickly. And just the same way we went from 70% Skype to less than 1% on Skype, I'm seeing this major shift to platforms that are recording locally, right? And there's some out there. Riverside, Zencaster, Squadcast that was bought by Descript, even StreamYard, where they are recording locally and then pushing it up to the internet. So it doesn't matter if you've got a bad internet connection, either on the host or the guest side, it doesn't matter because they'll record it locally and then push it up there. So think about this as you're looking at your podcast or being a guest on podcasts. Make sure that you're comfortable with things like Riverside, with Zencaster. If you're going on a podcast interview for the first time, make sure you check that out. If anything, I think they're even easier to use because over the last 4 years, it seems like Zoom keeps adding bells and whistles, and every time I look at it, something's changed. So if you look at this, how it's changed over time, right? Yeah, it's still a majority of Zoom, but you look at the ones that are growing. It's the people and the platforms that are doing video and doing local recording. And really, that's where we see everything going to. The other thing is that people will sometimes ask us, well, when are podcasts recorded? Right. And I think of someone, I talked to him earlier this week, great guest, but he also happens to be a state senator. And he's like, yeah, I can't book anything Monday through Friday when we're in session because you could get called away. I'm like, well, really, podcasts today are more of a midweek thing, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And this has changed so much from during COVID. During COVID, any day that ended in a Y was a good day for a podcast. Now it's really midweek. And it's funny, when we drill down into the days here, that 0.3%, excuse me, um, yeah, 0.3% that are done on Sunday, that's Sunday, the guest time. So those were typically people in the States in North America, our clients that were doing podcasts in Australia. So Australia Monday, for us on Sunday. The other thing is we look at it as getting more competitive. There's also a bigger wait time now. And I have to explain this a lot of times to new clients that they think podcast is like radio or television, right? I'll get invited today, record it tomorrow, and everybody will hear it. I always say podcasts are more like print media, where there's an editorial calendar, where there's a lead time to it. And this lead time has gone up. It's actually gone up 5 days over the last year. So I'm talking about the time between when you invite and when you introduce yourself to the time you get invited. And then that time between when you get invited to when you actually record it. And then the time from recording to it going live. So let's drill down on each one of these. The average time from introduction to invitation in our experience is 5 calendar days, right? There's always some outliers on there. There's some people that say yes right away, but the mean time is 5 days. And that's one of those things that I point out to people that if they're out there pitching themselves or other agencies that are out pitching, and I hate that word, right? We use introduction, not pitching. If you haven't heard back in, a week or 2 weeks, no answer is probably the answer. Where we're getting these ones that are further out is when we're introducing a new client and then they come back and say, oh, yeah, I didn't get back to you, but Tiffany Mink would be a great client, great invitation, right? I'd love to have her on the podcast. So just think about that. Podcasters are seeing your emails, and if they're not responding, that's probably an answer right there. And especially as it's getting more competitive, right? 22 guests for every eligible podcast. Podcasters really want to have 3 types of people. Their friends, their friends of friends, and people they want to be their friends. So when people work through us as an agency, they're tapping into our relationships. That's that friends of friends. And as you're positioning yourself, or we position our clients, we always want to make it look like somebody that the host would enjoy having a relationship with and really introducing to their audience. So this is the average time, 5 days between introduction and invitation. Now let's jump between invitation to recording. The mean time on that is 43 days. That's up substantially, almost 11 days since last year. So what we're seeing on this, it means that the best podcasts are scheduled further out. The best guests don't have the flexibility in their calendar. So it might take them on mean 43 days to connect and record. I think I said it before, right? The best podcasts are like doctors' offices and restaurants, right? If there's not a wait, there's a reason and a reason you don't want to be there. The more flexible you can be, the quicker you can be on there. And I always remind people, you're the guest, right? So you need to be flexible, work around the host schedule whenever possible. So think about it. It was 5 days between from introduction to getting invited, another 43 days from the being invited to recording. And then we jump into recording to going live. This one actually surprised me. It went down last year. Well, it used to be at about 42 days. Last year, the mean time was about 35 days on this. So just know that it there's some podcasts that are live, right? News podcasts. We don't work with them, so they're not in the mix here. We're talking more about interview style, big picture items, big picture strategic topics. There's a editorial calendar and people are taking time to edit these, to repurpose them. So pretty much figure that you've got about 40, what did I say, 35 days between when it records and goes live. And actually, that can help you. I think of the late, great Dan Miller. I always would tell the story that he was on a podcast. And in the middle of the podcast, he got this idea for a new download. And he said, we've got this download 48 low or no cost ideas, business ideas. And Dan wrote a book called 48 Days to the Work You Love. Well, at the end of the podcast, the host said, "Oh, I'd love to see that download." And Dan said, "Well, heavens, I would too. I just had the idea for it." And he knew that he had some time to create that and put that up there. So we talked about, the competitiveness, that the different platforms and how long it's taking. But one of the themes that you've heard me say here is video. And it's interesting that pre-COVID, less than 1 in 5 podcasts included video, right? It was less than 20%. Remember when COVID hit and we were all sort of trying to figure out how to use Zoom, and there were people that never had done the video portion? And boy, fast forward now, it's just become the standard. Videos become the standard with the platforms, with the technology, with the bandwidth. So I always tell people now, if you are on a podcast, just assume the video is going to be on there. Now, they may or may not use the video when they release it, but I really think it makes for a better conversation. You can pick up on those nonverbals, right? If they pick up their drink to say something, you don't throw it right back to them. This also means that in the same way that 5, 10 years ago, it was important to have great audio, you really want to start talking and think about what you can do to take your video to the next level. Video gets dated very quickly. So what is acceptable today could be laughable in a couple of years. And that's something we've been preaching to our clients. And you don't have to spend a huge fortune on it, but you have to be intentional. You have to be intentional on how you show up. And I guess that's my word. Don't know if you can tell it with the DSLR camera. It might be a little bit out of focus, but intentional is what we are doing here. So let's talk for a second about one of the big lies in podcasting. Have you noticed that everyone is a Amazon best-selling author and everybody is a top 1% podcast? Now, I don't want to say that it's not true, but maybe people are just using the data in different ways. And this is one where I think it's very, very interesting. The truth is that depending what database you look at, somewhere between 3 and 4.5 million podcasts. That's true. Fact, right? But of those, less than 15% have actually published something in the last 30 days, right? There's something in the industry called pod fade. It's very easy to start a podcast. 80% of podcasts that die within the first 10 episodes. So, do you compare yourself to the dead podcasts or to the active podcasts? And listen notes, if you go in there, it's got a little round ball with a question mark on it, and it will tell you this ranking is for all podcasts. So I always warn people, if they're looking off of those numbers, well, all podcasts are in the top 15%. When we launched our show, the Podcast Interview Marketing Show, I saw what kind of downloads we got, and they were very low. We weren't even in the top half when we launched. But yet, when I went to listen notes, boom, we were in the top 10%. So just remember that when you're looking at these numbers, what are they really saying? Right. I wrote an article a number of years ago about this. And if you're listening to this right now, you can congratulate yourself because you're among the top 7% of best looking people, most aerobic, most athletic. And you say, how could that be? Well, it's because the 93% of people are dead. And you're like, well, it's not fair to judge yourself against dead people. Well, it's not fair to judge yourself against dead podcasts either. And in here, you can see once again what we talked about. The numbers right now, if you start a podcast and get one download, you're in the top 13.2% of podcasts. So just make sure as a host when you're putting out numbers, or as a guest when you're looking, oh, this is a top whatever podcast, make sure that you're doing apples to apples, right? We always look at downloads per episode in the first 30 days. There's a couple of different databases that show that. One of them is Podchaser. Podchaser Pro, great database. We acquired their Connect unit last year in August. So, what is a top podcast? And Libsyn hasn't updated these numbers in a while, but what they were saying is that to be a top podcast, you need to get at least 1,200 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, right? Average podcast was getting about 150. Top 1% gets about 36,000. So if somebody's telling you that they are in the top 1%, that should mean that they get 36,000 downloads per episode in the first 30 days, right? They could get long tail off of that of hundreds of thousands or millions. But when we're looking at it from a guest perspective, we're only looking at that first 30 days because that's really what you can measure and what you can impact there. So where's podcasting going? It's funny. There's been some articles on this, and they said by 2030, the majority of podcasts will be in Spanish language, and it sort of makes sense, right? English podcasting took off. It came very mature. It's still growing, but it's maturing. The markets that are growing the most are Spanish language podcasts, right? Spanish is the second largest language spoken in the world. So you would expect that. And we're really working on that with Interview Valet Espanol. Now, finally, Tiffany's got some different resources here that she can go into. And I'd like to make a quick little pitch too. And I don't like the word pitch, right? And this is a request. It's not an introduction. What's ordinary to you is amazing to others, right? So if you have your data, if you have any data, please share it with the world. Put it out there because just the same way I was pulling numbers from Libsyn and numbers from PodPros and adding ours to it. When we all pool our data together, we all get so much smarter on this. You know, everybody's got an opinion, But when you get enough opinions together, then you've got some meaningful data. So with that, I'm going to stop talking here. I see there was a lot of questions rolling in there. I didn't try reading them as we were going because I would just get confused.
Yes, keep your train of thought. Um, yeah, I'll go through the list here of what came through. So we have a question from Chad. Do we know how many podcasts are live to an audience and recording also provided? I believe he's asking, like, are they how many? How do we know how many are actually being recorded live? Correct me, Chad, if I'm saying that correctly.
Oh, when we know that they're live, so they're recorded live and actually go out there, we know that from what the podcaster tells us and the platform they're using. So most of the people, when they were doing StreamYard, which is what we're on right now, great platform. If you're doing an interview, you can stream that live. So that was, if they were doing StreamYard, if it was marked as LinkedIn Live or Instagram Live or Facebook Live, then we knew it was live. Um, Even those, it's interesting though, because sometimes they will stream it live on Instagram, then they'll come back and edit it and then put it out as a traditional podcast. And so that's interesting. You almost get multiple bites at the apple, right? All the people that follow you on Instagram, they hear it today. And then a month from now, the people that just follow you on a podcast follow it there. And then years later, somebody's searching YouTube and they find you there also.
Right. And I think that's what he was asking with the second part of his question is, a recorded is also provided. So I'd say you address that there. And if it's going into their or their podcast um, catalog, then it's you're going to have that recording there as well, right? Like you said, it'll be there until the podcast goes away.
Correct. And our data is a little bit skewed. So we're only working with podcasts to get, the top 20% based in downloads. So if somebody is just doing a LinkedIn live, and they're not using it into a podcast where it can be found long term, we wouldn't work with that. But I think from the StreamYard data there, it looked like about 4% were doing it live, but then also recording it and repurposing it for podcasts in the traditional sense.
Yeah. And as we're talking about that, I'm interested to see how that'll change. I know the programs we use, different things like Wistia, StreamYard here, live streaming option is becoming more popular and more widely available than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. So we'll see next year if there's a shift toward that more live recordings like we're doing here today.
And I'm going to mention something on this too. And one of the reasons that we don't do as many LinkedIn lives anymore, when you do a live recording, and I can think of there was a gentleman that always had a LinkedIn live lunch once a week, right? His name will come to me. It was great. I used to turn it on when I was here and I'd listen. He had great guests and he'd turn it into a podcast interview also. That's tough because now it's whatever it is. Every Wednesday at noon, you got to be there at the computer. The
Yeah.
only guests that you can find are the ones that have to be there at Wednesday at noon. And as a host, God help you if all of a sudden something happens and the guest can't make it. Now you're there in an awkward thing. So doing live events like this can be more important or can be more technically and challenging. The other thing too is one of the reasons, and we'll talk about this a little bit, that we went to the podcast interview marketing show as a podcast was we were doing LinkedIn lives and we do a 45-minute section on welcome pages or 3 calls to action or how to pick audiences, why your podcast is not converting, all of those things. And we would set them up, but then the majority of people were listening to them or watching them recorded. So it's like, well, why don't we just get in the cadence of every week putting out a new podcast interview? And that's really what we started to test in October, and it's worked out really well. And to share the information.
Absolutely, and much easier on the producer part as well, like you said, the technical of you're a little bit more in control of getting that information and getting those episodes out. And this really leads into Tamara's question that she put in the chat. What frequency do you recommend for a podcast? I think she's meaning how often should a new episode be published? You kind
Yeah.
of just mentioned there weekly. Do you think that's the sweet spot, or is there a difference? Does it matter?
I think consistency is more important than anything. And let me give you an example on this, right? I think of the old Seinfeld show. What was it? Must watch TV or something on Thursday night. If he would have hit every other Thursday or was here this Thursday, not that Thursday, people wouldn't have stuck around. They wouldn't get in the habit of it. So I would challenge people or encourage them, whatever you do, make sure you can do it consistently. If that's once a month, that's great. If it's every other week, that's great. Where I see people get in trouble with this is they start with saying, "Oh, I'm going to do a daily podcast." And then life gets in the way, right? And they start falling behind. And all of a sudden, daily goes to twice a week, and twice a week goes to once a week. And it makes it look like it's a failure, right?
Mhm.
Flip side there, and I can think of two people that did this. Jamie J from oh, I can't think of the name of his podcast, Bottleneck. Um, and then Christopher Lockhead from Follow Your Different. They got so many episodes ahead that they're like, huh, should I go to twice a week now? Or, and instead, what they did is around holidays, they would drop bonus sections, right? They knew that people were going to be having extra time over the 4th of July or Thanksgiving or the year end holidays. So they would just drop maybe 3 or 4 episodes and call them, holiday bundles. And that's how they got going there. And that was a great way to engage with people when they had extra time.
Yeah, I like that. That's interesting. You kind of think that, oh, not to bother people around a holiday, but it's kind of the opposite. Like you said, they have a little bit more time. They're sitting around, not at the office as much. Really great point there. And Tamara then pointed out, and a second part to her question: is there a recommended ideal length for a podcast?
You know, this is one of those things of like, it's like, how long should a piece of rope be? Just long enough and not too long. Um, I think when you're looking at any data, you have to be careful of looking at big data, right? Because of what it says. One of our clients, Dr. John Johnson, he wrote a book called "The Little Lies in Big Data," and he really showed me this. What's the average temperature of the Earth? I believe it's like 55 degrees. That you wouldn't take that and decide how you're going to dress today, right? Because if you go out, if you live in Hawaii and you dress for 55, it's not going to work. If you're in Antarctica, it's not going to work. So that average is pretty much meaningless. One of the things to look at, I would say, is what does your audience like? And you can play around with this a little bit, right? You can see the number of downloads on the back end. Try testing. What does a 25 or a 30-minute um, uh, interview or a podcast look like? When it starts to get longer, do you get the same engagement? So I would test that. When we put clients on podcasts, we typically shoot for somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. The reason being is that most people are not media trained. They're like me and they just answer a yes, no question in 5 minutes. So if it's too short, neither the host nor the guest is succinct enough to get all the information in. Now, the flip side, if they don't love me after an hour, giving them 2 more hours of time is probably not going to change their mind. So I usually say somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. I'd look at your own data on that and think of the people that you're working or that you're talking to, right? How much time would they have in their life, right? I don't know, maybe a young mother with kids at home is going to have less time than somebody that's doing a long commute. Or if you're talking to people that are farmers, I don't know if you're in your tractor, maybe you're listening to podcasts. That's just a guess. We don't have the data on that, but I would test it and let us know what you find out.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I think the main thing it goes back to is who's listening, who is your audience, and how do they ingest the information, and also what you're talking about. Like you said, some interviews need a full 40, 45 minutes to kind of talk through the full idea and get the point across. Okay, let's see. We had another one here. This was more of a comment from I can't see your name. It just says LinkedIn user, but they were talking about asking to be on a show. I'm assuming this is a podcast host, and also they frequently guest themselves on other shows. And they mentioned they get 30 to 40 requests to be on a show on my show per week. I would love it if agents and potential guests would wait at least 2 weeks before pinging me again. And trust me, there's no need to ping me twice. That goes back to when we were talking about timelines and that gap between hearing back and waiting, and when should you reach out again. I know that's something we talk to with our clients as well, right? We call it the polite follow-up, and then when to let it go, right? No
Mhm.
answer is a no sometimes, oftentimes.
It is, and then also, I have to laugh at that because, we started our show in October. For the last, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 years, I get pitched to be on my show, and everybody would say, "Oh, I love the show and want to be a guest on it." I don't have a podcast, but, I was on some list, and, there's, people would scrape it and pitch me to be on the show. So, just put yourself in the host's perspective there, right? They're getting a lot of reach outs, be to the point, talk about how you can serve, right? Gary Vaynerchuk talks about jab, 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 right hook, right? I like to think about it as serve, 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 ask, right? So listen to the podcast first, know what it's about, leave a
Yes.
rating and review. We're all vain. We listen to that stuff. Now, ratings and reviews are meaningless to Apple and the rankings, but hosts listen to them, right? It's a social proof source. Share their content, um, like them, follow them on social media. Then you have earned the right to at least reach out to them. And once again, not to say, hey, Tiffany, can I come on your podcast and pitch my book? No, I've listened to the podcast and I think that I could offer value here, right? Serve. And once you do that, you'll have people that are asking you. One of our past clients, um, Gail Moody Bird, she's now the chief marketing officer for LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I love how she says we're getting more efficient at things that are getting less effective, right? So you can get a list of podcasters. You can, buy a list. There's a service out there that says that you can now pitch 1,000 podcasts in the time that it would take you to reach out to one. Well, more is not better. Better is better, right? Just because you can pitch 1,000 doesn't mean you'll get on better podcasts. If anything, you'll probably get a couple of yeses, but it's not going to be shows that you want to be on.
Exactly, exactly. And another point to that too is we remind guests that hosts are busy, right? Producing a show and putting a show together is enough work. And then in addition to that, many of them wear other hats. And that isn't their only job, right? They have other parts of their business that they do as well. So give them some grace, give them some time, and then also know when, it didn't work out. It's not, I'm not meant to be a guest on this show at this time.
And
Um,
let me go back to Tamara's question about how often also. Um, there is something that's been around for a long time and it's really taking off right now. It's called the Trojan podcast, and it's not a good thing. It's people using a podcast as a sales tool. And so what they're doing is they're doing a daily podcast. Sometimes they might even do 3 or 4 episodes a day, right? And what they're doing is they're reaching out there on Facebook posts, cold emails, all the rest of that, and say, I'd love to have you on my podcast. And maybe there's a pre-call with the sales development rep asking you some questions about your business. And then it's this cheesy transactional podcast that goes nowhere. Um, and it's like a 10-minute conversation, and then they go into their sales pitch, and you'll never get out of their funnel afterwards. It's just it it leaves you feeling bad, right? You felt like you were invited on something as an honor, and then all of a sudden you realized, oh no, you know, I just walked into that multi-level marketing room with a target on my head. So be careful on that. If you do have a podcast, make sure you promote the episodes, you post the episodes. That is the kiss of death. If you get seen as a transactional podcast, you'll get labeled as a Trojan podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes back to, like we said, it sending out 1,000 pitches to guest on a podcast doesn't do you any good, right? It's more about quality over quantity. I always point out, it's better to talk to a room of 100 of the right people than 10,000 of the wrong ones. Um, and that goes back to that it should not be treated like a transaction, but rather, a genuine conversation between two people that really have, something to contribute valuable to the conversation.
Mhm. And the other
Yeah.
thing too is like with guests, right? The industry has always been focused on more, 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 right? Because most most VAs and agencies out there are charging on a per interview basis, right? So the more you do, the more they get paid. The realization is out there that more is not better, better is better. And I can remember somebody that came to me and said, I want to be on 100 podcast interviews this month. And I said, why? Oh, because it'll be massive exposure. And we didn't work with them because it's like, no, it's going to be massive exposure, but not the type of exposure you want. And you will end up hurting yourself. And, put yourself in a host perspective again. Before you say yes to someone, you may look and go, oh, Tom looks like a great guest, right? He's got things that he could talk about. Let me check him out real quick. So they're going to go to your LinkedIn. They're going to go to your Facebook. Maybe they've got different databases, or they'll go to listen notes and say, what podcast has he been on? And if all of a sudden they see that you've been on, 4 podcasts in the last month, and you haven't promoted a single one, you haven't repurposed the any of the content, right? They'll look at that and say, oh no, this is just a transaction. Why would I want him on my podcast if he's just gonna, you know, it's almost like a one night stand, right? Use and
Mhm.
abuse my audience and then go on for there. Much, much better to do one great podcast interview a week, promote it, repurpose it, have a great content there, because then people, when they look you up, they're going to go, wow, this person really brings it. They promote it. This is someone I want to have on my show.
Absolutely. Yeah. Always better is better. More is not better. And this kind of goes back to, I want to circle back to when you mentioned a big podcast. I think this is something that we hear so much, right? Um, People show up and they're like, oh, I want to go on, the number one marketing podcast in the world, or the number one podcast. And we go back to, um, there's a difference between good podcast and good for you
Mhm.
podcast, right? Um, can you talk about that a little bit more? I know that's something that people get confused on, of the numbers, and they get so hung up on the downloads and the ratings and reviews, when really that's not what's important for you as a guest.
Right. So a couple things. One, there's a study out there out of Canada where they looked at all the podcasts and found no correlation between ratings and reviews and the number of downloads. And Apple has said there's so many bots involved right now and so many scammers that they don't even look at those in their ratings. The other thing is that this idea that you can't say enough of the right things to the wrong people or the wrong things to the right people. So just having a bigger audience isn't going to help you if they're the wrong people. Now, the other thing too that will have people come to us and they'll say, well, I need to be on bigger shows. Okay. Well, why? Because I'm not getting results with the smaller ones. Well, that's a fundamentally different issue there, right? If you're not getting results on a smaller show, why would you want to go on a bigger show? And as we said in the Navy, double down on stupid, right? Fix what's broken first. So, because you're probably only going to have one shot with some of these shows. So, starting on some of the more foundational shows can be a great way to figure out what messages resonate, right? What calls to actions resonate, what kinds of things you can do. And as long as you're getting the data there, you can figure out which shows are a base hit, which ones are a home run. And, we talk a lot about that, doing it through 3 calls to action, doing the welcome pages, so you can really attribute that. And once you start converting, that's when you say, okay, what other shows can we find that are like the ones we converted on? Maybe it's time now to go for larger shows. But it's this idea of bigger is not better, better is better. And I remember somebody gave an example to me, right? Fish are in water, right? Fish live in water. So I'm going to go to the ocean because it's a bigger body of water. And I know that's where I'm going to catch, largemouth bass, right? Nope, wrong kind of water, right? So you've got to figure out what that is. And sometimes bigger is not better, better is better. And this is my personal experience. I think early on, I was on a show, big name show. It was more of an ego thing, right? And it was 40,000 downloads per episode, right? I got probably, I don't know, a handful of leads from it, but it was an ego thing. I could put it up on my bio. Shortly after, I was on a show and it was the ideal audience. And the host apologized to me because she only got about 200 downloads per episode. I'm like, that's okay. It's a great, great show. I'm here to bring value. Tiffany, on that one, I got over a dozen paying clients, right? It was like fish in a barrel. So, you know, 40,000 gets, 10 leads, or two or 300 gets a dozen clients. Man, I'll go back to that one every time.
Every time. Exactly. Great point there. Um, I believe we got everyone's questions. I apologize. Tom and I usually double check the chat once we log off. So if we miss something, we will get back to you. But as we wrap up here, Tom, I'll ask you one final question. What's some future predictions for podcasts? What do we think we'll be talking about in next year's State of?
I I still don't know if the name podcast is going to stick around, right?
Yeah.
I spoke at an event at Harvard. It was called Sound Education. This was probably 2018. And at that point, they made the comment that when radio first came out, it was called wireless telegraph. Now,
Okay.
we went from there to radio. Here we started with podcast when it was only downloaded on your podcast. And now it's gotten to be YouTube, terrestrial radio, satellite radio, clips on Facebook. I think we're going to see the format changing, right? So that we can create in the way that we want and repurpose in the way other people want. I think it will be more competitive, that you better show up better because there's more competition. The bar has been raised. Go back and listen to podcasts from 10 years ago. It's cringeworthy, right? When BBC came in, when NPR came in, when some of the big players, the audio level, the video levels all went up. And I think it's helped the community there. And that's one of the reasons that we're focusing more on video and being aware of what's going on here. We talked about our podcast, the Podcast Interview Marketing Show. Today, I had the opportunity to interview Arthur Joseph, right? Anybody that has ever been one of my clients has heard me tell the stories about Arthur Joseph. He's been the NFL speech coach for over 3 decades, right? Most of the Hall of Famers in the NBA, in NFL, some of the broadcasters you see, Arthur was their speech coach, and he talks about vocal awareness. And I think that's so important as we communicate and use this, that it's not just showing up and talking like a Zoom call. No, it's being
Yeah.
aware and communicating there. So I think the future is very, very strong for podcasting, whatever we call it. I think that it will be repurposed in all kinds of different ways. And I think even now you're seeing people not calling it a podcast anymore. They just call it a show. That's fine.
Sure. Yeah, it's a little bit more inclusive, like you said, as it moves to different platforms, YouTube and even live recordings, like we mentioned. So, yeah, great stuff. I put the link over to the podcast interview marketing show there in the comments. But yeah, I urge anyone to listen to, especially your episode today, like you said, with Arthur Joseph. Really powerful stuff, even if not just for podcast guests, but anyone who does any type of speaking like we're doing here today, even if you're just doing speaking, training your team, right? Doing presentations for your team, really powerful stuff. And getting him to not only talk about it and share his wisdom and insights, but um, to practice it in real time. You know, you kind of go through a meta um, exercise there. Really great stuff, powerful things. So we invite everyone to go check that out as we wrap up here today. But um, do we have anything else, Tom, or are we ready to close it out for today?
I would just say we all have ideas, we all have feelings, but we make decisions based on data. So look at this data, see how it impacts your life, your decision as a guest, as a host, and think about that. As you get data, share it with the world. And while we said this is our first and probably only live LinkedIn Live this year, we will be talking about things every week on the podcast interview marketing show, available on wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. So please check that out. If you have questions, always reach out to us. What's ordinary to you is amazing to others.
Absolutely. And with that, as Tom said, thanks for joining us today. And we'll see you here on LinkedIn or on the podcast. And always please reach out to us and take care. Until next time.